Hello, honeys, and welcome to another new episode, our last full-length one for the month of July, and what a month it has been. Highbrow Honey officially became a podcast network, and I officially became a small business owner, which still feels a little surreal to say out loud, but that has also led to a lot of good things, like the introduction of our theme music this month. On a more personal note, I got to visit my family this month, which was pretty nice, and our rugby season for the summer also pretty much ended, so we should not have any concussion-related delays again for the next several months. Our episode today is a bit of a special one for me because we are talking about the first guy I ever wrote an art historical essay on as a little baby freshman just beginning to get into the whole art historical thing. As we talked a bit about in our how-to reel we posted to the gram within the last couple of weeks, visual analysis is the main tool that art historians use to look at and interpret art. And this is the first guy whose artwork I got to practice that on my own. I was really intrigued by Hofmann's practice, the very three-dimensional nature of his techniques and the depth he's able to achieve through his various paint strokes. We talked a lot about what I referred to as color works back in part 2 of ATPPO series, and Hofmann was the first to have me really understanding what was going on there, how the techniques they were employing achieved the effects they were looking for. And so, without further ado, here we go, Hans Hofmann, the godfather of color theories. A basic summary of who Hofmann is so that you have a general idea as we head into our episode here. With his emigration from Germany to the USA in the 1930s, he brought a unique blend of French and other European modernist styles as well as ideas to the US, and that affected almost everybody over here at the time, but especially his students, who went on to become future greats. Those included Lee Krasner, Helen Frankenthaler, Alan Capro, and many more. Hofmann was a close friend of Jackson Pollock and a huge contributor of fusion styles to abstract expressionism as well as bigger theories of art. He's one of the most important figures of post-war American art, widely celebrated for his very color-saturated and exuberant canvases. But honeys, we're going to do it a little different this time, and we're going to combine history in with the bio. We're going to put Hofmann in context. I think this way will be a little more cohesive than how we tried to separate out Da Vinci from The Last Supper in our previous episode. So let's give it a try. Beginning with the beginning instead of beginning with the end, which would be silly because the end is the end and the beginning is the beginning. You need the beginning to get to the end, and we can't start with the end. So, of course, we're beginning with the beginning. Hofmann was, in fact, born as Johann Georg Albert in Weissenberg, Bavaria in March 1880 as the second of 5. He showed a ton of interest throughout his childhood and into his teens in music, math, art, sciences. In fact, as a teenager, he patented several scientific inventions, one of which was a radar system, after the family moved to Munich when he was 6 for a new government job of his father's. Between 1902 and 1904, Hofmann studies with Slovene artist Anton Osby, whose previous students included very notable Russian artists Alexei Jawlensky and Wasily Kandinsky. The Albert family hoped that he would keep on this very sciencey, very lucrative path, but Hans decided at 18 to be an artist instead. He promptly enrolled in Moritz Haymann's art school, also in Munich, and was introduced there to new styles like Impressionism and Pointillism. Pointillism, for clarification, is the technique of using infinitesimal amounts of tiny color dots to create a cohesive color block and image. Think George Seurat's Sunday at the Grand Jet, for example. Of course, during this time, as we all must, he is growing up, he's entering young adulthood, and 1889 is a particularly big year for him because that is the year that he not only meets his future wife, Maria, aka Ms. Wolfgang, it's also the year that he obtains a patron through either another teacher or else a peer of his. Said patron was department store owner Philip Freudenberg, By obtaining this patron, he basically secures financial support for the next decade. And in 1901, Freudenberg even goes a step further. He pays for Hofmann and Mies to move to Paris. After he moves there, Hofmann's able to begin studying with big Paris avant-gardists, everybody from Henri Matisse to Georges Braque, the Cubist rival of Picasso, as well as the Delaunis, a very impactful arts couple. Hofmann is able to get in on this very historical moment of idea sharing, and it shows in his art, some of the first works that he did there in Paris. To demonstrate his interest in pointillism, for example, and his exposure to it, some of the first portraits of Mies done at this time are in that technique. So Hans is there, he is learning and studying and socializing and soaking up all this brand new take, really, on what art is and what it should be coming out of the turn of the 20th century. Things begin to shift, though, as we hit the mid-19-teens. In 1913, for example, Mies and Hans decide they're going to take a French island tour and then head to the Munich suburbs to temporarily care for one of his sisters. Seems like a perfectly normal thing to do. However, 1913. So when World War I breaks out in 1914, they're still there in Munich. The couple essentially becomes unable to return to their own home in the blink of an eye. And just like that, Hofmann loses all of his existing work, or at least access to it. One of today's sources, a webpage by the Artists' Rights Society made on behalf of the Hans Hofmann Trust, says of that situation, quote, attempting to locate the possessions that he and Mies left in Paris, Hofmann writes letters of inquiry to their former landlord, but none of their belongings are recovered. Hofmann would continue to pursue compensation for this loss for the next decade, end quote. Now, he does eventually get it. In compensation for the loss of his property in Paris, Hofmann is awarded a loan of 180,000 marks from Germany's Imperial Indemnification Office for war damage. However, this is still after World War I, and those marks, even though there's a lot of them, some question about their value. But coming back to 1915, as that's where we left off, of course, the war is on, but Hofmann is not drafted. He actually is in too poor of health, so they're like, pack up, go home, you're through. How could we make a man out of you? Anyway, he hears that, and he's like, well, gonna have to find something to do because me and Mies are here. We need a place to live. I need, to make an income. Perfectly logical thinking. But then Hofmann makes a decision that's not only going to change his entire future, but will also affect the entire course of art history as we know it. He decides he's going to open this School of Fine Art, or in the original German, let me try this, Schule für Bildende Kunst. He almost immediately starts to receive attention for it. And in fact, Barnaby's, another of our sources for today, refers to it as the first school of modern art in existence. New York City's MoMA agrees, saying that it built on the ideas and work of Cézanne, as well as Cubists and Kandinsky, and united and refined the skills, the techniques, the styles of a generation of German artists. As far as our sources indicate, that's pretty much how he spent the rest of the 19-teens and a good chunk of the 1920s. He also marries Mies in 1924. The 1930s, however, is the decade where Hofmann starts to go through some major life changes. For example, the year 1930 itself marks his first visit as well as extended stay in the U.S. He made the trip to guest teach at UC Berkeley upon a former student turned staff member's request. Across the next handful of years, he guest teaches at various other California schools, and as things continue to head south in Europe in the early 1930s, he moves to the USA. But he also decides to do it his way. He opens the Hans Hofmann School of Fine Arts in 1933. It is an extremely successful school, but he does continue his own practice throughout the rest of his life, and we'll touch on that as we go along. In 1934, he moves the main school to 57th Street in New York City, and in 1935, he opens a summer school satellite location in Provincetown, Massachusetts. The Art Story notes that this school of his was not a place for casual beginners, but for serious students, long-standing ones, to hone their craft. He emphasized in the school repetition and did not pedestal any styles or mediums, although it is true that many who came out of the Hofmann School did work in paint. It's also significant that the Hofmann School did summer sessions in Provincetown because that was a very important site for 20th century arts development. Especially throughout the early decades of the century, it was considered a very purist sort of avant-garde colony. It was considered by many of the day to be an ideal escape from the New York urban environment during the summer months and the best way to achieve sole focus on one's studio work. So by the 30s, Hofmann has been creating art as well as teaching other artists, seeing all kinds of experimentation. And so at this time, he's starting to develop his own specific terminology, his own rhetoric. One of the most important pieces of this rhetoric, one of the most important ideas that emerges from all this study and teaching and being soaked in art for so many years, is that Hofmann develops his infamous push-pull theory. The BAMPFA, or the University of California's Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, explains that the theory is most often actually associated with his signature works coming out of the 1950s and 60s. But it is the idea that one should make up a work of bold color planes that seem to emerge from and recede into the energetic surfaces of the intersecting and overlapping shapes. It's an idea of creating depth without creating false perspectives. And it's fairly significant that he was expressing the basics of that idea so early in his career, much earlier than I think most give him credit for. The push-pull theory was inspired for Hofmann by Cézanne's Fauvist explorations of color, especially in his paintings of the same scene done in different color tones based on time and atmospheric conditions. Hofmann also took into account these interdependent relationships between color, form, and space. He essentially believed that pictorial space can't be dependent on a single point perspective, for example, linear perspective. Instead, you must use contrasts of color, shape, and surface to acknowledge the flatness of the canvas while still playing with the idea of overlapping contents. Rather than believing in peeling them back like an onion, he wanted you to not be able to tell exactly what was in front of the other. Artform, in fact, quotes him as saying, "It is all wrong with Italian perspective. It has only one direction in the depth, but nothing comes back. But in my pictures, it goes back and comes, it goes in, and it comes back," end quote. Almost all of our sources for today agree that the works from the 1930s shed light on how Hofmann is attempting to evolve away from figuration and move towards abstraction, especially after his move to the USA. Hofmann is able to move away from his early blends of symbolism, neo-impressionism, fauvism, and cubism to abstract expressionism. And he makes this very drastic change in a way that, as Art News points out, not a lot of artists are successful at doing. But it seems like Hofmann was just that kind of stubborn and curious guy. We can quote his own writing here. He says, "What I would hate most is to repeat myself over and over again." To demonstrate what I mean a little bit with this evolution, we'll compare Bouquet from 1932 to Apples of 1934. Bouquet is much more representational. The colors are a little duller, but they're ranging cool and warm tones. There's very organic forms for the most part, lots of figures shown, not many spare marks. Apples, however, is much more cubist. The colors are more saturated in brighter and warmer tones. And in fact, you can see a shift of warmer at the top, cooler at the bottom. And the organic forms are still very rounded, but everything else is extremely geometric. It's very difficult to distinguish what the other objects that rest on the same table as the apples are. The 1930s come to a close, and as the 40s start, Hofmann is 50. He's solidly in his middle age, and he's just continuing to see bigger success and name recognition, especially with the rise of the Abstract Expressionist movement. So, the 1940s as the origins of Abstract Expressionism and what exactly that is. In a nutshell, Abstract Expressionism is kind of the umbrella term for everything that came after regionalism and social realism. It's considered, though, to be the first authentically American avant-garde. And according to the MoMA, our dear friend Hofmann is considered to not only have partly preceded, but also partly created it. Abstract Expressionism was a result of its times. So let's go over very important contexts. It emerged from New York City in the 40s. The exact year depends on who you ask, but it's made up of largely American artists who want to achieve the effects of the movement's name. They want abstract and they want expression. The influences on the artists who were a part of Abstract Expressionism, though fascinatingly, go back to the 1920s. So let's talk about how the Great Depression actually created the movement. A significant portion of the artists who made up the Abstract Expressionists got their starts with employment through the Works Progress Administration or other relief programs. These launched their careers. That did begin to change once economic conditions began to change. By the late 20s, things start to stable out, and as a result, the U.S. becomes more open to international exchange again. For the artists, this meant that there was an ever-broadening and ever more interconnected international arts scene. This sets the stage for a lot of early modernist ideas, a lot of this sort of exploration that will become popular after World War II. It was an important time for establishing this art as meaningful to its own day. In fact, several major arts venues, especially for viewing European works by the likes of Picasso, Matisse, so on, began opening in the late 1920s. These exposed many American artists to a whole new world, basically, of modernist ideas. For example, the MoMA itself opened in 1929, and the predecessor to today's Guggenheim, the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, opened in 1939. The 20s and 30s saw a general shift away from representation and towards abstraction. A lot of this is seen in what's called European lyrical abstraction or art informel, both of which were pretty big across the pond at this time. Essentially, artists were able to enjoy this nearly unprecedented exchange flow of ideas, morals, stories, anything the world could provide, because they now had these new physical forums for it, and they also had the support of various patrons, as well as the eye of the general publics of the US and Europe. Though we know there was a brief period of prosperity following World War II in the US, the artists coming into their own at this time, even through the 60s, were forced to deal with the effects of the war, the cultural isolation, as well as economic suffering of and in the USA. This affected the production of art, especially solo art done in private studios or residences, as well as the themes found within it. Artists were still reckoning with their experiences within those tough last couple decades. Both World War I and World War II are crucial to understanding abstract expressionism because they were largely its impetus. Many of the Europeans who ended up participating in, if not leading, the movement fled to New York City to avoid World War II. They connected again in the US and thus had major impacts on the development of American art throughout the next several decades. Some of these artists include Andre Breton, Dali, Max Ernst, and Pete Mondrian. The MoMA notes that this often led to fusions of styles within the works of the abstract expressionists. They point to, for example, Adolf Gottlieb, who, quote, infused his work with imagery inspired by Native American sources. Others, like Clifford Still, were so disillusioned by the horrors of war that they chose to eschew traces of European tradition altogether, end quote. For many artists, the wars were a look into the evil potential of humans. They were a grand and horrible experiment of our irrationality and our vulnerability. The artists were concerned with substance, especially making use of everything effectively. Very wartime idea. And a lot of these heavy themes, death, life, spirituality, emotion, trauma, bodies, and bodily gesture, a lot of it ended up in the art. So through much of the movement's existence, its timeline, there's a lot of reflecting on and dealing with the past that is coming up. A lot of trauma and paranoia there. Well, then the Cold War sets in, and that gets absolutely no better. After the initial post-war prosperity, Americans generally become concerned with this power and paranoia atmosphere of the era. And also, remember McCarthy? Well, artists had to become really careful about what they incorporated into their art and the messages they sent, even here in the US. This may explain why, in part, abstract expressionists turned to the total non-figural. As with any other movement, abstract expressionism has its common themes, practices, through lines. One of those through lines is that, as I mentioned, many of the artists start figurative and later ditch that part, but do decide that they will continue to have personal experiences as the bases of their work. The abstract expressionists are aiming entirely to break from conventional subject matter and techniques. They're aiming to tap into something universal about all humankind, to not necessarily make it easy to categorize their styles, and often work at monumental scales. The Tate says abstract expressionist works are often characterized by these gestural brushstrokes or mark making, the idea of spontaneity that you can see through the motion of the body through. The MoMA notes that it usually incorporates unusual materials like house paint. Regardless, abstract expressionism is a movement largely inspired by not only the surrealist idea that art should come from the unconscious mind, but also the sort of automatic or not thinking about what you're doing as you're doing it idea of Joan Miro. Abstract expressionism is a fascinating case study in how a movement can evolve and split, however. They began as a cohesive, searching for a timeless and powerful subject matter, turning to the oldest myths and archaic art for inspiration in a very Jungian psychology overlap. And at this point, they all emphasize directness in expression, with works often featuring pictographic or biomorphic elements. Within that first generation, however, by about the end of the 40s, they began to split into two camps. The first, as you might guess, is the action painters, who started to establish themselves in 1947. They were led by Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning, much more championed by the critic Harold Rosenberg, and worked in this spontaneous improv manner, often using large brushes. Some had intelligible figures in these works, others no, but all are very high physical energy. All reference the artist's gestures, which were considered their signature and the proof of the work's creation process. And on the other hand, of course, we have our color field artists, the Rothkos and Barnett Newmans. They were more championed by the critic Clement Greenberg and were deeply interested in religion and myth and created these very simple compositions featuring large areas of color, thus associated with formalism. The higher interest in how one presents formal elements like line and hue than the contents of an image. These are our color works, the ones meant to help you achieve the sublime experience of an emotion by wrapping you up into the work. So this abstract expressionism, this movement, is what Hofmann is working with throughout the 40s through the 60s, which is why we just talked about it so in depth. But the 40s are a pretty good decade for him overall. He continues to have success with his US-based school. He begins receiving praise in group shows, leading to individual shows and other successes through the decade. For example, he has his first major solo European show in 1949. In the early 1940s, Hofmann shows a fairly clear transition towards the more recognizable later styles of his career. He shows a lot of high-energy gestural qualities at this time, beginning to experiment with drip techniques alongside Pollock, for example. He begins cementing some of his defining philosophies and beliefs at this time. Though push-pull is fairly well established by then, he begins to express this belief that the ultimate accomplishment of art is to unite physical with conceptual. He begins to care less about pleasing the viewer and more about stimulating their eyeballs, their visual interest. Hofmann is also fairly spiritual, which makes sense given his closer alignment to the color field sect. He demonstrated a belief that art should speak, but was much less rigid than many of his day on which colors or how many to combine in order to achieve that effect. Hofmann also believed nature was the basis and origin of all art. He believed that all styles shared a common root in the history of art, so different approaches could still achieve the same universal goal, the absorption of the artist into the work. And no matter how abstract his pictures, he insisted on links to the real world, real objects. Let's take a look at two artworks for the early decade. First, The Poet, 1940, in the Art Institute of Chicago's collections. This one can be considered evidence of Hofmann's interest in Kandinsky and Kandinsky's lyrical techniques and approaches at a time with gestural marks and very rounded forms and curving lines were popular. But it's the way that Hofmann does it here, non-figural, but also not very geometric, generally warm, vibrant colors, that makes that connection pretty clear. Then you look at Landscape from 1942 in the collection of the North Carolina Museum of Art, and it's a whole different story. There's many abstract, geometric, and colorful elements, but it importantly features a lot of stacked or interrelated rectangles and other geometric shapes in various hues. It has so many hints at his future style. As we head into the late 1940s, things just keep getting better for Hofmann. He attracts the attention as well as the advocacy of huge modern art sponsor and collector Peggy Guggenheim. Yes, that Guggenheim. The relationship continues throughout the rest of their lives. Throughout the 1940s, the Hofmann School continues to have tons of success by various metrics, but it's also largely competing with and contrasting the Bauhaus-trained Joseph Albers' program over at Black Mountain College in North Carolina. Whereas Albers and Black Mountain stressed multi-medium and multi-skill learning, Hofmann students mastered studio work with focus on a single artistic medium, often easel painting, first. Black Mountain offered many instructors and potential experiences, especially with the social networking aspect in a rural environment. Hofmann School, however, just had him working with the students individually and somewhat intensely in a largely urban setting. The calendar pages fly on by, and eventually we're in the 50s, which turn out to be just as great to Hofmann as the 40s were, but also the beginning of the end for abstract expressionism. Hofmann he started that decade with a bang. 1950 was a big year for the artist. Hofmann was among 18 notorious artists who published a letter on the front page of New York Times in May that year, alleging that the selection jury for the Met's exhibition American Painting Today was, quote, notoriously hostile towards modern art, end quote. It's unclear if anything much came of that besides reactionary follow-up headlines. 1950 is also the year that the Art Institute of Chicago selects Hofmann as one of the jurors for its 60th annual American exhibition, and one artwork to touch on as an example of his early 50s works, the Magenta and Blue of 1950, held by the Whitney. It features a pineapple, desk, and other barely recognizable elements, while evoking the still life and interior subjects often associated with Fauvism, Cubism, and Expressionism. Though Hofmann, as we mentioned, had played around with all of these styles in the previous decades, here we see development towards his own types of abstraction, especially with the geometric focus. Hofmann appears in a Paris Modern Art Show in 1951. In 1955, the critic Clement Greenberg hosts a show of his work at Bennington College and goes on to support him through the rest of their lifetimes. Hofmann has his very first solo survey staged at the Whitney in 1957, and in 1958 he finally retires from teaching, closing his schools for renovations into private studios. He used those for later works. Hofmann is then featured in Documenta of 1959. Documenta is one of the oldest, most prestigious international art fairs. It's hosted in Germany every 5 years. In some ways, all of this attention, this acclaim, all of these shows, it's a good thing. It cements Hofmann's legacy and makes sure that abstract expressionism cannot be left out of the art historical record. So let's reflect on what the artwork of Hofmann's shows about abstract expressionism and about his evolution at this time. We'll look first at The Conjurer from 1959. This one's really neat because it almost evolves from geometric into fluid forms across the canvas. There's a more intense color range in one section than another, and it shows the diversity of Hofmann's mature style, according to our sources, by showing how he uses different densities of color and spatial relationships to create this psychological effect instead of any objective reality. The late 50s through the end of his life is when Hofmann creates what I think he would consider his best work based on the desire to create that push-pull effect. Every work that I've seen from like 1956 on, it's the same frustration almost that he attempted to build up in the viewer of, I can't tell what is supposed to be deeper than the other. It depends on where exactly my eyes are on the canvas. When I look over here, that thing looks deeper. When I look over there, it looks shallower. So he's really mastering everything that he's been working at for the last 30, 40 years. We're able to see this, for example, in The Gate of 1959 through 1960, currently in the Guggenheim collection. The Gate is part of a bigger series of work, all loosely based on architecture and volumes. Though the image is without a clear subject, it shows how he uses these almost literal blocks of color to achieve various effects, to create various emotions or relationships. 1960 turns out to be another big year for Hofmann. He represents the U.S. at the Venice Biennale with a handful of others. The Biennale that year featured 13 of his works and labeled him as, quote, the acknowledged dean of abstract expressionism, end quote, saying he was the oldest U.S. proponent of the movement. The 60s are arguably the epitome of Hans Hofmann's career in multiple senses. I found a hilarious quote from Art News describing the works that Hofmann produced in his last decade of life, the 60s, and it goes a little something like this, quote, what makes Hofmann's work so exhilarating is that it is often so gloriously, genuinely, unrepentantly ugly. To degrees the paintings of his contemporaries rarely are. There's too much happening in them and certainly too many competing colors, end quote. To his credit, however, the competing and ugly colors did inspire later artists such as Cecily Brown. And I'm well aware, honeys, that it would be a little mean of me to bring up potentially ugly art and then not share it with you. So let's take a look at a couple of, let's call them funky pieces of Hofmann's from 1961 through 1962. First up, Summer Night's Bliss, 1961. It resembles clouds in its colored and interwoven patches of raspberry, mustard, rose, blacks, and browns. For this reason, it's considered exemplary of Hofmann's push-pull. It successfully creates the illusion of space and movement. Delirious Pink of 1961 was actually an abrupt change for Hofmann. Here, he has a white canvas with only a few spurts of color in a very joyous fashion. But then we come across Candor of 1962, and we can see much more of the stereotypical Hofmann. I would say this piece is very restrained for him because there's only 3 hues, but he still manages to play with push-pull as these rectangles potentially surpass or tuck behind one another. It's impossible to tell if the red or the green is in front based on their slight staggering and those hue changes. Furthermore, there's a lightness, an ability to see through the canvas in the brushstrokes next to the red rectangle, allowing that part of the canvas to seem like it's a raised bump. The Minneapolis Art Institute, its current holder, says that it's a classic example of abstract expressionist painting in that there's no figurative or narrative representation, but rather it explores the fundamentals of painting, form, color, and gesture. Back to the history, though, MoMA hosts the exhibition Hans Hofmann and His Students in 1963. The show celebrates Hofmann as a teacher and an artist while acknowledging and promoting the accomplishments of his equally influential students. The show goes on an international tour between 63 and 1965, so Hofmann becomes internationally recognized as a very important 20th century painter and influencer of artistic development. The 1960s is when he gets a ton of awards and really the recognition that he's been due. He receives an honorary membership in the Akademie der Bildenden Kunst in Nuremberg, an honorary Doctor of Fine Arts degree from not only Dartmouth and not only UC Berkeley, but also Pratt Institute of New York, and receives the Solomon Guggenheim International Award. Unfortunately, his companion and partner of almost 60 years, Ms., passes away in 1963, and Hofmann responds by working through his grief. Many consider his work To Ms. Pax Vobiscum of 1964 to be a vibrant canvas that does serve as a memorial. Art historians cited by our sources today note that these admittedly bright colors create shapes which express Hofmann's feelings of loss. In 1965, however, Hofmann remarries to Renate Schmitz, who is a 34-year-old German woman. He travels with her as his quote-unquote niece, likely because she is 50 years younger. She becomes the inspiration for the Renate series of 1965, and according to the Met, who has them in their holdings, these were done in bursts of creative energy by Hofmann that year. The Met recounts the words of the late Henry Geldzager, the first curator of 20th century art at the Met Museum. It may be seen as the final summation of the themes, thoughts, and stylistic invention for which Hofmann was so successfully concerned in the last years of his life, end quote. Hofmann passed away in New York City in February 1966 at the age of 86. And with our story essentially concluded, let's talk legacies. The legacy of abstract expressionism first. Again, pretty much ran its course by the 1950s, but had so many long-term impacts. AE effectively shifted the arts world focus from Europe, specifically Paris, to New York in the post-war years. Many generations of European and American artists were profoundly marked by the breakthroughs made by the first generation of abstract expressionists and went on to their own greatness. Examples of these, Jasper Johns, Warhol, Rauschenberg. As we covered in our Colorworks episode, abstract expressionism was used to some degree to counter the impacts of artwork made by communist forces or in such regional styles throughout the 1960s. Abstract expressionism made possible the careers of several notable 20th century women as well as other second-generation artists. The aforementioned second generation of AE, it included Ellsworth Kelly, Frank Stella, Joan Mitchell, Elaine de Kooning, Lee Krasner, Joan Mitchell, and more. With the dying out of abstract expressionism, emphasis on the whole shifted in artistic themes from the interior subjective self and world to the objective exterior reality, Abstract Expressionism inspired artists to analyze and question what gave the image of things meaning. The second generation of abstract expressionists also established San Francisco as a major arts and culture hub. Though it was not explicitly stated anywhere, I suspect this may have unintentionally contributed to that West Coast, East Coast, not a whole lot in the middle dynamic that we see in the American arts scene to this day. The legacy of Hans Hofmann continues to evolve and change and grow with each new generation of American artists. Barnaby's says that the current auction record set by Hofmann was for Lava 1960. That sold for $8.8 million at Christie's in 2017 and was the cover work for Hofmann's 1963 MoMA retrospective. Though he himself was a giant presence and an incomparable creative mind, he is undoubtedly the most famous for the impacts of his works theories as well as his work as a teacher. Hofmann split from the crowd in a very crucial way. So many of his U.S. contemporaries were much more interested in Picasso and Cubism, but Hofmann's devotion, really, to Henri Matisse's colors undoubtedly influenced many after him. He goes down in history as one of those rare artists who can not only inspire, but who can model creative development, stylistic evolution across his entire career. As Art in America notes, he mastered everything from tracing to dripping and splattering to the tiniest of brushstrokes, and these changes were present in all of his experiments. His art, as a result of this play, had big influences on the theories of Greenberg as well as Rosenberg, two huge critics of the 20th century whose names continue to be regularly brought up in art history, especially via his emphasis on such ideas as flatness of canvas and unity in the work. Hofmann will always be remembered as a unique and as a crucial link between American and European modernism. He was the only one to be involved directly in both camps. The emphasis on both originality and mastery in Hofmann's teaching style allowed his students to go on to prove Hofmann's belief that regardless of one's medium, an artist must first thoroughly learn the craft and the history in a studio, and then they can go beyond and defy formal training to create something original. Sure enough, that's what almost every recorded student of his has done. Though we must have a small note of humanization here, he was a man of the 50s, and he believed in the things that men of the 50s believed in. He did not think terribly highly of women. Though he worked with and taught, famously, female artists throughout his life, he shared these common macho prejudices that many members of the New York school, cough, cough, Pollock, were very famous for. He doubted that women were the equals of men, that they couldn't achieve the same level of spirituality in art needed to pull it off, and they just could not possibly understand his all-important push and pull method. For example, the artist Lee Krasner, amongst other of Hofmann's students, have told the same story about him visiting Krasner's studio and saying, "Wow, this is so good," quote, "you would not believe it was done by a woman," end quote. Hofmann certainly wasn't perfect, as none of us are. Whew, my lungs hurt a little after that one. That was a lot of talking. And because I'm tired of doing the talking, we're going to wrap it up here. That is Hans Hofmann, that is Abstract Expressionism, and that is the intertwined legacies of both. I hope you enjoyed learning about the Godfather of 20th century color theories and him being a teacher, albeit an imperfect one. I will catch you Tuesday for the business honeys, and until then, take care of yourselves, think positive thoughts, drink lots of water. Yeehaw. This podcast and this episode were created, produced, hosted, and researched, as well as fact-checked by yours truly, Celia Bugno. It was edited by our brand new sound engineer and producer of our intro music, Chris Meinhold. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on all of your favorite streaming platforms, as well as your social medias.